for that, Holly. People are going to think we conspired over this when they hear the stuff I've got to say, but it isn't true. So, yeah, teasingly, we were asked whether even chaplains are amongst the everyone who are called to be evangelists. In my ecumenical chaplaincy team, that ruffled a few feathers, I can tell you. Well, I'll be honest with you. I've never seen myself as an evangelist in what Holly described as the stereotypical understanding of that word, in that narrow sense. But I am a Methodist. And so, of course, I have an evangel. I have a gospel to proclaim. And in that sense, of course, the chaplaincy, like any form of Christian ministry, is a form of evangelism. So it depends, I suppose, on what you mean by evangelism. And that's why I put in the chat that definitions of evangelism are quite difficult. I have to say, I can fully embrace the definition that was given to us in the Evangelism and Growth Report to Conference, which talked about representing and proclaiming Jesus. I don't have any problem with that definition at all. But if that's the definition, you then have to look at how you go about that representing and defining. And for chaplains in secular context, which is where most chaplains work, that's the hardest task of all. How do you appropriately represent and proclaim Jesus in those contexts? Now, I've been a chaplain in higher education now for 10 to 15 years, but I've been a minister for 26 years. And in that time, I've served as a chaplain in hospitals, in primary schools, in a town centre chaplaincy, and as well as in higher education. And what I've learned over those 26 years is that context is everything. I've tried, I hope, over those years to be incarnational and contextual in my ministry. And context will often dictate to us how the gospel is to be embodied. For most of my ministry, the context, even as a chaplain, has been limited in scope and clearly defined because I was, for most of that time, also the minister of a local church. And that puts constraints upon the work that we do as chaplains, because everything is anchored in the church community and in church life, and everyone sees you as the minister of that church. And there are some constraints that puts on you. So as a hospital chaplain, people who asked to see me were expecting Christian pastoral support, because that's what they were effectively asking to receive. As a chaplain to the local CRE primary schools, I was expected to offer a Christian perspective into collective worship. And as part of the town centre chaplaincy, we were the local clergy doing that job, and people saw us as part of the local Christian community. So even when we were reaching out in those contexts, it was still church work that we were effectively involved in. It was the work of the local church. And the church, therefore, had a strong degree of control over that work. When I answered God's call into higher education chaplaincy, that opened my eyes to a new reality. Here was a reality of the church, the work of the church that has truly left the building and it now journeys faithfully, trustfully out into institutions of secular society in which we minister. And now this is work that is not so much church work, but kingdom work. And the control has shifted. As Holly has already mentioned, we become a guest in a host institution. And that sense of control over the work that we do is different entirely because we work in a different context. And that loss of control is one of the vulnerabilities that Holly was mentioning, that we have to learn how to exist having sacrificed that sense of control over the work that we do. One thing I've discovered is that part of the context in which we work as chaplains is the context of suspicion about our motives and intentions. For several years, the Vicar of Ormskirk and I, with our congregations, we offered a befriending ministry to international students at the local College of Higher Education. It was a limited ministry and it was welcomed. And the vicar and I thought that that was something that we could extend on. And we went to see the Vice Chancellor of what was now a university and the directorate. And we offered chaplaincy services to the whole university, not just to international students. And we were promptly turned down. And the sort of things that were said when that happened, words like student choice were voiced. And there was I sense, a degree of suspicion about what we were after. What was it that we wanted as a church to get out of this offer of chaplaincy? And many people who are part of secular organizations in which we offer chaplaincy will be suspicious of us and what it is that we're about. What are they in it for? Can they really be as inclusive as they say they are? And so even when Edgehill University invited the vicar and I to be part of the founding members of a multi-faith chaplaincy team there, they still insisted that we sign their statement on proselytization, because that suspicion was still there in the background, even though we'd built relationships with them and they were a bit clearer about what we were offering. Now, part of the suspicion comes from misunderstandings about what chaplains are about. And some of those misunderstandings come from the stereotypes that Holly was talking about. People think they know what Christians are about when we offer chaplaincy, and for the most part, they don't. It's not just proselytizing that they're concerned about either. They think that we might be in the business of moralizing, or that we might be in the business of judgmentalism. And one of the first hurdles a chaplain faces, it seems to me, in any secular situation is the need to rebuff those misconceptions and to allay the fears that people have. And we also need to be clear ourselves and honest with ourselves about what our motivations are. Now, I think Methodism is in a prime position to be able to offer chaplaincy. And I'm a great champion of chaplaincy as a model of ministry. Methodism began in the university and began offering chaplaincy within prisons right at its inception. And our church has for a long time answered that call of God to witness to the presence and the love of God within those secular environments. It's a humbling privilege to be allowed to minister in higher education. But it is only possible because chaplains over time have won their place to do that, and have been welcomed, as I've said in another place, as what valued guests of the host institution. And we need to be committed to a wider perspective than one that is simply faith specific. So it seems to me evangelism within secular contexts in which we work is a ministry of it's a ministry of being as much as a ministry of doing or saying. I like to see it as answering that call to be the leaven in the lump, or the salt of the earth, ministering to sheep without a shepherd, all of those gospel images that spring to mind. And for me, chaplaincy is a ministry at the margins, not in terms of social deprivation, as that phrase might ordinarily be understood, but it's at the margins of what I want to call faith awareness. Most of the kingdom work I do in the universities among people who have no faith at all, and don't really desire to have any faith when you first meet them, or they've been involved in the church on the periphery of faith, and they've moved on and said, no, thank you. But people like that are still deeply grateful for the support that comes to them from chaplains, chaplains who are committed not to proselytizing, but to embodying God's love for them. So God is in every conversation that I have in the university, whether God is mentioned in that conversation or not, because God is the context for my being there. My own faith tradition teaches me that God cares about how people love one another, how they love sacrificially and across all barriers and difference and division. I'm convinced that God's call to us in this day and age is to an evangelism aimed at transforming people's lives and communities through love. This is the value of our ministry. This is our gospel to those people who will never become Methodists, who may never become Christian disciples, and yet who turn to us for help, for understanding, for friendship, for allyship, because it's a ministry that does not shut the door. It does not turn its back. It doesn't expect anything in return, least of all, a bum on the seat. Most people who seek a chaplain's help are looking for someone who is willing to listen with patience, without judgment, someone who will always make the time. And we do it because ours is a ministry that seeks to love for love's sake. That's the chaplain's gospel. That's the evangel that I have to represent and to proclaim. Much of the work we do is one-to-one. And so as chaplains, we have to trust in God. We have to rely on our own faith resources and the strength of our relationship with God. Our work has to be underpinned by prayer, not just our own prayer for ourselves, but the prayer of the Methodists who send us into these places and support us. We rely on the Holy Spirit equipping us and the love of Christ channeled through us, meeting people where they are in the name of God's love, whether they're Christian or not, trusting that those we meet will somehow encounter something of the unconditional love of God in Christ. As chaplains, we're here as the embodiment and the ambassadors of that love. I'll give you a light-hearted example. Our chaplaincy in Leeds encourages what we call our unity initiative. We gather people together regularly to eat. Back to the Emmaus story. We gather around food, and we gather regardless of difference. People of many faiths, many cultures, coming together to celebrate being human together. About 4 years ago, we decided that as part of our unity message, we would rename the month that we're in at the moment. And so this is no longer November, as far as we're concerned. This is Love Ember. And Yeah, I know it sounds twee, but bear with me. What we're trying to do is encourage members of the university's community into intentional acts of kindness to one another. And one way we do it is we take out a trolley and we give away hot drinks and cakes and sweets in the name of love. Do you know how suspicious people are about something you give them for nothing? So we explain who we are, and we explain why, as people of faith, we want to simply give out love and kindness, asking one thing in return, that the people pay it forward, that they go on and share some of that love with the folk they relate to day by day. It's a simple thing, but you'd be amazed at how spirits are lifted by that sort of thing, and how the message is embraced and the community enriched. But Holly spoke about comfort zones. I want to just offer a note of caution. And it's about the appropriateness of our evangelism. Chaplaincy happens outside the walls of our churches, in communities and organizations that celebrate the diversity of their demographic. People living, working, studying alongside others of different races, different cultures, different faiths, and so on. Methodism is not the only Christian denomination with a desire to evangelize. Christianity is not the only faith tradition wishing to attract others into their fold. So, working alongside people of other faiths, working alongside people of different denominations, is an area in which tensions can arise, an area in which the watchword has to be respect and sensitivity. So I encourage you to carefully look for the help of organizations like the Interfaith Network and other ecumenical Christian bodies in establishing how best to share in conversations about faith in such diverse communities, because it can be a minefield. The Interfaith Network has a booklet called Building Good Relations with People of Different Faiths. It's an excellent resource, especially its guidance on ethical witnessing, which urges respectful, courteous sensitivity and the acknowledgement that people are free to disagree with us. I would also add that I have some of my best conversations about God and the life of faith with Muslim colleagues and students. Making and nurturing Christian disciples is part of the work I do as a chaplain. But for me, it isn't anywhere near as important as helping people become more fully the loving human person God created them to be. And I cannot commend enough to you or to our church this ministry of lived evangelism.